Today, as I said, we will hear from Valerie Phillips. She's of Cherokee and African-American descent, lives in the Miami, Florida area. She's been a Baha'i since 1989, raised in Chicago, went to her first powwow at Navy Pier, right there in Chicago, graduated later from Wellesley College and went to the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. She has mostly been working as an attorney since then, though she's also taught. She was an attorney at the Shoshone-Bannock tribal office, attorney's office, and she's also had solo practice. She has taught business and business law at Washington State University. She's been a law professor at University of Tulsa College and has published various scholarly journal articles, mostly on topics related to indigenous peoples. She's also participated in United Nations working group meetings on indigenous peoples in Geneva and in New York City, and has traveled quite extensively both around the world and to various native reservations and meeting of native peoples across North America. So we're very excited to have her talking about the place of the Baha'i faith in the authoritative texts of the Baha'i faith. And so, Valerie, welcome. Thank you very much for giving us this presentation today. And I think we can now switch over to your screen so that we can watch your slideshow and see you as well.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the special place of America and the Baha'i authoritative text. I'm going to be focusing here on American exceptionalism, from the Doctrine of Discovery to Manifest Destiny. I'm going to be focusing in on the experiences, some of the experiences of American Indians in the United States during the time that these Baha'u'llah was writing, and during the time that Abdu'l-Baha was traveling to the United States, and bring it forward to the present. So first I'm going to start with a definition of American exceptionalism so we all know where I am, be on the same page. American exceptionalism has been historically referred to as the belief that the United States differs qualitatively from other developed nations because of its national credo, historical evolution, or distinctive political and religious institutions. The difference is often expressed in American circles as some categorical, that there's superiority, to which is usually attached some alleged proof, rationalization, or explanation that may vary greatly depending on the historical period and the political context. So it's a positive, it's seen as being a positive thing, the city shining on the hill, but it's also, the term can also be used in a negative sense by critics of American policies to refer to a willful nationalistic ignorance or faults committed by the American government. Common elements of American exceptionalism are things like Republican ideals, the frontier spirit, mobility, and the American Revolution. So the Republican ideals have to do with this this idea that the U.S. is special, it's exceptional because it's founded on a set of Republican ideals. The idea being it's not founded on a common ethnicity, like Germany or France or Spain, or common heritage or a ruling elite. The frontier spirit idea is that, there's this American identity out there, or American spirit that can be, it's really the idea of expanding outward. And it's best understood not as a continuation of certain European ideas, not as the interpretation of such ideas, but as an entirely new set of phenomena deriving from the unique interaction between the white man and virgin lands. And then this idea of mobility, which we're still, very well known for, where we're the land of opportunity. That's an exceptional thing, and it's exceptional because we have this occupational and physical mobility that other people don't really have, and it's independent of the social circumstances surrounding one's birth. And then, of course, the American Revolution. This is supposed to be the origin of exceptionalism. On the other side of that, you have people who say that, well, you did have a ruling elite. The founding of America was from, England. People from England coming over just became dissatisfied with their own country, and so you did have in the United States in the beginning with the colonies, and then with the early United States, you had a ruling elite because, for example, only white males, wealthy white males actually, landholding white males could vote. And that was, for quite some time. And so others have noted that that really means that there was you really did have a ruling elite here. And in fact, there's also the opposite view as far as the frontier spirit. What is that really? What are we really talking about? This is equated with the white male and his interactions with the New World, and then with mobility. That's something that today it's not really seen as being unique to America. I'm not sure that it was unique to the United States even back then, because only certain people could move up from poverty to, let's say, the middle class and even the upper middle class. And today, it's even less so. You have Europe and Canada having higher rates of people having upward mobility. So, so there's, and arguably, as far as the American Revolution is concerned, we have other, there were revolutions in England, even as the revolution was going on in the United States and in France, and so they have democracies today, they have constitutional monarchies and so forth. So there's a back and forth about this idea of American exceptionalism. And so you also have people like, today in 1963, we had Martin Luther King saying things like, and why we can't wait, pointing out that our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles of racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated that tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today, we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore, all exalted. And so, well, basically what I'm going to be doing here is talking about these things and how they relate to the Baha'i faith, the development of the Baha'i faith, and some of the writings in the Baha'i faith. And what was going on at the time, what was going on with Native Americans at the time that Baha'u'llah was writing, actively writing the sacred writings, and what was going on at the turn of the last century when Abdu'l-Baha was, started traveling, when he traveled through North America in 1912. Okay, so so this will involve looking at why, learning something about how Native Americans experienced these two doctrines, the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny, which I'm going to explain in a little more detail later on in my talk. But right now, this slide that I have up here about the Choices program at Brown University, I'm not going to be able to go to. This is a very short video where you have a professor in this program talking about, this is Professor Christy Clark Pujara. She's talking actually about African American slavery. Her main focus, her scholarly focus is on African American slavery. And but she references Native Americans as well. And the reason I wanted you to see this video is because she points out how important it is for people to know what is the history, at least the basic history of Native Americans, as well as African Americans and the slavery that occurred here. Because if you don't know that, you don't really know the United States. You don't really know America, and you're also saying that these groups, African Americans and Native Americans, they don't really belong here. anyway, so that if you don't know this, you don't have at least the basics about, slavery in the United States, at least the basics on Native Americans, you don't really know the United States, and you don't really know it's like those people don't really belong. Native Americans and African Americans don't really belong here. They're not really a part of the United States. And, her statement is based on this it's a program developed by it's a project of the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's called Teaching Hard History, and I hope people can see this. I put this in front of my face. This is it said Teaching Hard History, a framework for teaching American slavery. This is something that I came across in my capacity as a high school teacher of comprehensive law studies. And this has recently come out by the Southern Poverty Law Center. They said that, America, the United States, really needs an intervention on slavery, on the subject of slavery. Because if you don't really understand, American slavery and the role of Africans in it and the role of whites in it, you don't really understand the civil rights movement. Taking that forward, slavery was a while ago, but you don't really understand today the civil rights movement. You don't understand the Voting Rights Act and all these things that we should be knowing as Americans. So they pulled together this information because they had actually done a survey of U.S. teachers about, how they felt about teaching African slavery. And they came out with a couple of findings. The first one is, which is already known, that 80% of teachers in the public schools are white, which isn't particularly significant in and of itself, but when it comes to teaching American history and African slavery in particular, these teachers themselves reported that it was very difficult for them. Because it's very uncomfortable. That was one thing. It's an uncomfortable topic. It's a difficult topic. That's one thing. The other thing is that teachers don't really have the resources for teaching that. We don't have the textbooks. They don't have the textbooks. There hasn't been this emphasis on it. It's been kind of played down and ignored for so long. And in your social studies textbooks and your history textbooks, it's just not covered. So they don't really even have the tools, even if they're, overcome that lack of comfort, that discomfort. It's very hard to find the tools that they can even use, the resources. And then there's the question of, who the audience is, who the student audience is. There were, also, if they had a predominantly white students, how were they going to deal with this, with all these other handicaps they had? So the Southern Poverty Law Center actually came up with this. This Teaching Hard History, it's wonderful because it's a bunch of resources. They pulled together all kinds of resources for teachers, social studies teachers in particular, and it's available online. That's how I got it. I've incorporated it into my comprehensive law classes, that sort of thing. And this is only this year. This has only come out this year. But they have lesson plans in there, original documents, and so forth. So I'm saying that to point out how, we're all affected by this because we all went through the school, right? At least in the United States, I wasn't taught about slavery. I mean, I found out about all that well into adulthood, okay? So it handicaps us in if we want to teach as well. So let's look at what was when Baha'u'llah came out with his, I'm going to switch gears a little bit here and go into the writings. You see that on your screen, that slide, from the Proclamation of Baha'u'llah to the rulers of America. And this is from 1867 to 1873 when he was in exile to Akkal, the Adrianople exile to Akkal. And so I'm going back to the period of time when, he did these messages to, various rulers across the globe, including this one that he sent to the rulers of America. Now, this is starting in 1867. This is after the slaves had been freed in the United, just after the Civil War and after the slaves had been free. And he says, "Hearken ye, O rulers of America and the presidents of the republics therein, unto that which the dove is warbling on the branch of eternity. There is none other God but me, the ever-abiding, the forgiving, the all-bountiful. Adorn ye the temple of dominion with the ornament of justice and of the fear of God, and its head with the crown of the remembrance of your Lord, the creator of the heavens. Thus counseleth you he who is the dayspring of name, as bidden by him who is the all-knowing, the all-wise. The promised one hath appeared in this glorified station, whereat all beings, both seen and unseen, have rejoiced. Take ye advantage of the day of God. Verily, to meet him is better for you than all that whereon the sun shineth, could ye but know it. O concourse of rulers, give ear unto that which have been raised from the dayspring of grandeur. Verily, there is none other God but me, the Lord of utterance, the all-knowing. Bind ye the broken with the hands of justice, and crush the oppressor, who flourisheth with the rod of the commandments of your Lord, the ordainer, the all-wise." So the question I asked at this point was, who was the broken? Baha'u'llah refers to the broken. Bind ye the broken with the hands of justice. And who was the oppressor at this period of time in the United States? Who was the broken and who was the oppressor? And because Baha'u'llah is addressing the rulers of America to bind the broken, to bind them with justice, and to crush the oppressor. So my view is that he was actually referring to the broken Native Americans, because at that point in their history, they were really at a very low point, and the oppressor would be really white Americans at that time. The rulers of America, that's who the rulers of America were at that time, okay? So, and I'm going to move on to, and this is where I'm getting this from, the idea of the, I mean, we had European settlement of the Americas, and there's a European Christian origin to this whole idea of the doctrine of discovery, which really undergirds the U.S. system of law, and in a way that we also are not taught. In the same way that we really don't, right now, we're not getting a lot of detail on, you know, the kind that we should to teach tolerance in with African slavery. We're also not getting enough information about what was going on with Native Americans. So I'm going to go through a little bit of that, and this is, I'm going to go way back to you know, the 1490s, where you had Columbus coming and so forth. And so this is the European Christian origins of the doctrine of discovery. So this was a papal bull, an intercedere that was issued by Pope Alexander VI, and it was in 1493, a year after you know, Christopher Columbus discovered America. And this papal bull stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, and it declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion was to be exalted everywhere and increased and spread, and that the health of souls were to be cared for, and that barbarous nations, which would be the American Indians, the native peoples, be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. The doctrine of discovery included slavery. So you have, under various theological and legal doctrines, non-Christians were considered enemies of the Catholic faith, and as such they were less than human. So you have another bull, which was also part of the doctrine of discovery. This doctrine of discovery is a series of papal bulls. This one from 1452, where Pope Nicholas directed King Alfonso to capture, vanquish, and subdue the Saracens. Saracens is an old-time name for Muslims, pagans, and other enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery and to take all their possessions and property. So this is where you got this European Christian idea that it was the Christian thing to do, that God authorized Europeans to put Africans in slavery. Though American Indians were initially put in slavery, but then they switched to Africans for various reasons. And this is justified by Christianity, and it was done through the authority of God, and to also take their possessions and property. Let's see. So let's see. This, if you're going to really understand the connection here between Christendom's principle of discovery and the laws, the actual laws of the United States when it was formulated, when the United States actually came into being, you have to look at the papal document from 1452, where there's a declaration of war against all non-Christian people throughout the world. This is of the whole world, okay? They weren't even, Christopher Columbus hadn't even set foot on any part of the Americas, and they were declaring war against all non-Christian people, and specifically sanctioning and promoting the conquest, colonization, and exploitation of non-Christian nations and their territories. And in fact, the Doctrine of Discovery is still in place in international law today, and you can see that it's part of the Christian. It was part of the Christian law of nations, which asserted that Christian nations had this divine right based on the Bible to do these things. So over the next several centuries, these beliefs gave rise to what's now called the Doctrine of Discovery, which is used by Spain, Portugal, England, France, and Holland. These are all Christian nations that, you know, engaged in colonization all over the world. Okay, so the Doctrine of Discovery essentially became the basis of all European claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion. So you have a U.S. Supreme Court case, which is a very pivotal case in federal Indian law today, that came about back in 1823, where you have Chief Justice John Marshall giving an opinion that the principle explicitly stating, this is the U.S. Supreme Court explicitly stating that the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to New World lands. In essence, American Indians had only a right of occupancy, which could be abolished by whites. Okay, and so I'm going to take this forward then to 2018. That was back in 1823. Okay, and as I said, this is a very pivotal case in federal Indian law. Then, and it is now, taking it forward to 2018. The papal bulls, the bull and cetera, made headlines recently, again, throughout the 1990s and in 2000, when many Catholics petitioned Pope John II to formally revoke it and recognize the human rights of indigenous non-Christian people. Now, overall, basically, the response here in 2018, the Doctrine of Discovery has not been formally revoked by either Pope John Paul or Pope Francis, though both of them have been approached about either revoking it or repudiating it. That hasn't happened as of 2018, as of now, nor has the Doctrine of Discovery been formally revoked or even repudiated in laws that are applicable to the indigenous peoples within the United States, Canada, New Zealand, or Australia. But there were things that did go on and that were going on at the time that Baha'u'llah was writing. I did have a video that traces the Doctrine of Discovery to manifest destiny, that idea that America is expanding across the frontier, and European Americans, and you can see that in that photograph of the painting by Gast in the beginning of the program, where it shows you Columbia, the female representation of Columbia, big picture floating over, westward over the American lands and chasing away the American Indians and Buffalo and so forth into the darkness, and that whole idea of manifest destiny. And Professor Robert Miller actually has a talk on it that you can take a look at in that link. I can't actually get to it. I did want to show you just a little bit of that. but I won't be able to get to it. But he traces the Doctrine of Discovery and explicitly shows how it became incorporated into this whole idea of manifest destiny. And the idea of manifest destiny was very, very, very popular at the time Baha'u'llah wrote to the rulers of America. Let's see, slavery in the nation's highest court, Paul Finkelman. Okay, so this is a little bit of background on U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Marshall, who wrote this Johnson v. McIntosh case. I'm going to skip through some of those slides in the interest of time, because I do talk about how some of these cases relate to the Marshall Trilogy in particular, how these cases relate to federal Indian law, but I'm going to skip through because I want to get to the Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah, and that in 1857, 1858, this is during his exile in Baghdad, because he's talking about justice. Okay, manifest destiny is actively going on in the United States at that time. It's appearing in newspapers. I mean, this was part of the popular culture at that time. And this is what Baha'u'llah was writing about justice, just justice, not specifically to the rulers of America, but justice. O son of spirit, the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. Turn not away therefrom if thou desirest me, and neglect it not, that I may confide in thee. By its aid thou shalt see with thine own eyes, and not through the eyes of others, and shalt know of thine own knowledge, and not through the knowledge of thy neighbor. Ponder this in thy heart, how it behooveth thee to be. Verily, justice is my gift to thee, and the sign of my loving kindness. Set it then before thine eyes. Okay, so we have the best beloved, not the second best or third best, but the best beloved of all things in my sight, being justice. And Baha'u'llah saying that at the height of manifest destiny in the United States. And then if we look again at the Proclamation of Baha'u'llah in the period from 1867 to 1873, you have him addressing elected representatives of the peoples in every land. So this would include the United States, because they were electing their representatives. Now, American Indians weren't citizens, of course. They were, basically citizens of their own nations at this time. So the elected blacks, the slaves had been freed by then, but there really wasn't, the people who were electing representatives were really still just whites, and the whites who could vote. There was here and there, the white woman could vote, but that wasn't really changed, until the turn of the 20th century. Okay, so he's addressing the elected representatives of the people in every land, so he's addressing also congressmen, congresspeople in the United States, people at the state level who had been elected as well in the United States. So he was saying, take ye counsel together, and let your concern be only for that which profiteth mankind, and bettereth the condition yet thereof, if ye be of them that scan heedfully. Regard the world as a human body, which at its creation whole and perfect, hath been afflicted through various causes, with grave disorders and maladies. Not for one day did it gain ease. Nay, its sickness waxed more severe, as it fell under the treatment of ignorant physicians who gave full rein to their personal desires and have erred grievously. Now, this is quite a criticism of elected representatives. And if at one time, through the care of an able physician, a member of that body was healed, the rest remained afflicted as before. Thus informeth you the all-knowing, the all-wise. Okay, so elected representatives, he's saying basically you're not doing your job. You're not doing your job. And so he goes on to say, we behold it in this day at the mercy of rulers so drunk with pride that they cannot discern clearly their own best advantage, much less recognize a revelation so bewildering and challenging as this. And I put in bold myself, and whenever any one of them has striven to improve his condition, his motive hath been his own gain, whether confessedly so or not. So whether elected representatives admitted it or not, they were after their own gain. at this period of time. That's what Baha'u'llah was saying. And the unworthiness of this motive hath limited its power to heal or cure. That which the Lord hath ordained as the sovereign remedy and the mightiest instrument for the healing of all the world is the union of all and its peoples in one universal cause, one common faith. This can in no wise be achieved except through the power of a skilled and all-powerful and inspired physician. And basically, your elected representatives, including the ones in the United States at that time, were not at that point. I can't get to this video here, this 1491 video on the untold story of the Americas before Columbus. This is an 8-part docudrama series that I was going to try to show just a trailer of it to give viewers an idea of what some of the what people are saying today, academics and scientists, of the Americas was like before Columbus came here. This is based on the Charles Mann book, 1491. And then I was going to show you, this is a trailer from, this is a PBS series. And this, I hope you can see this. It's a PBS series called We Shall Remain, America Through Native Eyes. And this came out a number of years ago. And it goes through the experiences that how Native people, how they viewed the coming of the Europeans to this country. And there's a quote up here that you can see. Every tribe in this country has a time of horror, absolute horror, when they were confronted by this invader. And that's a quote from this, the We Shall Remain series. And this is something that, is important to understand, that this horror that was going on was, again, this was all at the same time of the manifest destiny and when Baha'u'llah was writing, when Baha'u'llah was addressing the rulers of America as well as the elected representatives of the world. Let's see if I can show you kind of the back of it too, just so you can, see what it looks like, a little bit about what it looks like. And it's a series of DVDs. And like the Teaching Hard History, this one that has lesson plans and a ton of resources. This also has lesson plans and things that you can use if you're interested in teaching this and also educating yourself. So basically what you have is by the period of 1867 to 1873 up to Baha'u'llah's death in 1892, every tribe in the United States had experienced absolute horror. Every one of them, with no exception. And in fact, 2 years before Baha'u'llah died in 1892, you had the Wounded Knee Massacre. That was just 2 years before Baha'u'llah died. And one thing that I always thought was significant, I thought it was very significant that Baha'u'llah died 500 years from the year 1492 when Columbus first set foot in the Americas. So I do have some other slides that I am going to just give you an idea of who some of the rulers of America were at the time of Baha'u'llah wrote, and also who some of the rulers of America were when Abdu'l-Baha was traveling, gave talks, and also when he was traveling through the Americas, and some of the things they were saying and doing with American Indians. Just to give you an idea, and I'm going to go kind of quickly through them again in the interest of time, but just so you know, and I'm looking at the presidents, not so much Congress, so Congress had a big role as well. And you can see this quote. Here's a quote from Theodore Roosevelt. He was president from 1901 to 1909. He's basically responsible for that, that saying that some of you may have heard of, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. The only good Indian was a dead Indian. So, these were things that were explicitly said and done by the rulers of America for a long period of time with respect to American Indians. And here you see some of the things that occurred with the Indian commissioner under that, at that period of time. And so you had Baha'u'llah during this time, he was doing his talks that became Some Answered Questions, the book Some Answered Questions, which I have here. And so this was actually, you know, this was going on contemporaneously with Abdu'l-Baha's talk, and later on with his, when he was visiting North America. The Bureau of Indian Affairs outlawed the sun dance and other American Indian religious ceremonies. Indian territory was dissolved. I mean, one of the things that Abdu'l-Baha said in his talks that appears in Some Answered Question in 77, number 77, the right method of treating criminals. He has this quote where he says, "As forgiveness is one of the attributes of the merciful one, so also justice is one of the attributes of the Lord. The tent of existence is upheld upon the pillar of justice and not upon forgiveness. The continuance of mankind depends upon justice and not upon forgiveness." Now, this is something that Abdul was saying when he was talking about how we should be dealing with criminals. And I included here because I believe that Abdu'l-Baha, when he was talking and writing, and Some Answered Questions specifically, he was including criminals in those people who had basically invaded and colonized the Americas. And I'll show you why I think that. In that same portion of Some Answered Questions, it says, Abdu'l-Baha says, to recapitulate, the constitution of a community depends upon justice, not upon forgiveness. Then what Christ meant by forgiveness and pardon is not that when nations attack you, burn your homes, plunder your goods, assault your wives, children, and relatives, and violate your honor, you should be submissive in the presence of these tyrannical foes and allow them to perform all their cruelties and oppressions. No, the words of Christ refer to the conduct of two individuals towards each other. If one person assaults another, the injured one should forgive him. But the communities must protect the rights of man. And I've put underlined and bolded in there that's not in the actual Some Answered Questions. But because when he says, when nations attack you, burn your homes, plunder your goods, this is all the invader. This is all what was going on with the invasion of the Americas and colonization from the native viewpoint, and even from, I believe, from an objective viewpoint. But I think that this is where Abdu'l-Baha is specifically placing colonialism, including the colonization and the formation of the United States and its subsequent history with respect to American Indians. It's putting it in the category of criminals and how they should be dealt with. And here I do have some, because Abdu'l-Baha was speaking at that, in the early part of the 20th century, and he had this journey across North America in 1912. I show you what some of it here. This slide shows you what William Howard Taft was president then, and what was going on with American Indians at that time. And their numbers, American Indian numbers, had greatly reduced at that time. And you had a flood of immigrants from Europe coming in, millions of people actually coming in from Europe specifically. The U.S. government did not want, and the American people did not want, if you look at the history of immigration, they did not want immigrants coming from Africa or Asia or whatever. They just did not. They wanted people coming from Europe. So American Indian population had dropped really dramatically. And these were some of the things that were going on at that time, where there was loss of millions of acres of land. This was in the early 1900s when Abdu'l-Baha was journeying across North America. You had the reservations that had been negotiated in treaties and so forth after all the wars in between the tribes in the United States, those were being broken up, and surplus land, millions of acres, I think it was like more than 3 million acres, was during this period of time when Abdu'l-Baha was journeying across North America. It was going from the hands of American Indians into the hands of whites. And so that by the time you come to Shoghi Effendi, who's writing The Advent of Divine Justice, he is saying things, and specifically to the American believers, he's saying, it is to the American believers particularly that I feel urged to direct this fervent plea to ponder in their hearts the implications of this moral rectitude and to uphold with heart and soul and uncompromisingly, both individually and collectively, this sublime standard, a standard of which justice is so essential and potent an element. And even after the death of Shoghi Effendi, you have Ruhiyyih Khanum in the Priceless Pearl, referring to back to some of the things that were going on with the Shoghi Effendi in the 1920s, like in 1923 to 1927, where Shoghi Effendi is referring to confusion and the gross materialism in which mankind is now sunk, and then he writes to the American National Assembly, is specifically saying, in the heart of society itself, where the ominous signs of increasing extravagance and profligacy are but lending fresh impetus to the forces of revolt and reaction that are growing more distinct every day. And again, I think this is definitely can be, was referring to, and if you look at other slides, to the American Indian population. And for example, you have in 1934, you had traditional Indian practitioners. They were denied access to sacred sites outside of the reservation, often on federal lands, even though there were treaties that they should at least have that access, and those lands were taken at that time. So you had all these religious suppression within the United States, which we really don't know. We don't know about this, such that there was so much, though, oppression of American Indian religious beliefs that you had an act, Congress finally acting in 1978 with the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, because there was often an abridgment of religious freedom for traditional American Indians. And I see part of that's cut off, but it should say American Indians. Okay, so going back to the Priceless Pearl in 1941, Shoghi Effendi was really criticizing society at this point, and he was also specifically criticizing Europe and the United States. So I have underlined here where Shoghi Effendi dwelt more openly and frequently on this subject, pointing out that although Europe was the cradle of a godless, a highly vaunted yet lamentably defective civilization, the foremost protagonist of that civilization was now the United States, and that in that country at the present time its manifestations has led to a degree of unbridled materialism which now presented a danger to the entire world. Okay, and then in 1954, a letter in which he pointed out that the country of which the American Baha'is formed a part is passing through a crisis which in its spiritual, moral, social, and political aspects is of extreme seriousness, a seriousness which to a superficial observer is liable to be dangerously underestimated, and so on. I mean, these are several, references to crass materialism, and how this is being carried to contaminating the Asiatic peoples and nations, and crossing into Africa and invading its very heart. And let's, okay. And so this is, bringing it forward. Then bringing it forward to President Obama. So you have all these forces going on, where this tension between the traditional American exceptionalism conception of American exceptionalism and the conception that Obama came up with. And this is his speech. These are some taken from his Obama speech in Selma, Alabama, which was commemorating the civil rights campaign that spawned the Voting Rights Act. This was also known as Bloody Sunday. And in that speech, Obama had a different conceptualization of American exceptionalism than the ones that, the original one and the one that is in Manifest Destiny, where Obama declared that America is great not just because of what it was, but because of what it's becoming. He said America is not some fragile thing that can't tolerate citizens demanding change, and that he asked, what greater form of patriotism is there than the belief that America is not yet finished, that we are strong enough to be self-critical. And you also have religious organizations like the World Council of Churches specifically taking up this doctrine of discovery and talking about and coming out with statements on the doctrine of discovery and its impact on indigenous peoples today. So, and that's what this slide is. It's the World Council of Churches. It's from 2012, where they are denouncing the doctrine of discovery formally and stating that it is something that has been very damaging to indigenous peoples. Particularly, it's looking at, as an example, English, Portuguese, and Spanish colonization in Australia, the Americas, and New Zealand. All of those proceeded on the doctrine of discovery as Europeans attempted to conquer and convert indigenous peoples. And then they even talk about the Johnson v. McIntosh case, that 1823 case that I talked about in the back from the United States, where this case is enshrined in federal Indian law. It's in current law today. And they pointed out that the Johnson case has been cited repeatedly by Australian, Canadian, New Zealand, and United States courts. That means today, okay, in their law today. And the doctrine of discovery has been held by all these countries to have granted European settler societies what's called plenary power. That means domination. Plenary power means absolute power over indigenous peoples, the legal title to their lands, and so forth. And Europeans believed this was proper based on their ethnocentric, racial, and religious attitudes that they and their cultures, religions, and governments were superior to non-Christian European people. So we have a change in among some Christians regarding the acknowledgement of the doctrine of discovery and a repudiation of it. A repudiation that this had not occurred at the time that Dr. King observed, when he was making his statement, and why we can't wait. But it has in 2012, these kinds of statements are coming out. And that's a little bit more from it. And then talking again about the 1823 case of Johnson v. McIntosh, and again, how this is related to, they're specifically repudiating it and calling for, pointing to the sorry state of indigenous peoples right now because of as a result of the doctrine of discovery, and calling on Christians and governments to the various governments that have adopted this into their laws, which would include the United States, to dismantle those legal structures and policies based on the doctrine of discovery and dominance, so as to better power and enable indigenous peoples to identify their own aspirations and issues of concern. And they make their request, this formal request. This is a statement that is on their World Council of Churches website, asking governments and states of the world to ensure that their policies, regulations, and laws that affect indigenous peoples comply with international conventions, and etc. So this is a Christian organization actually asking for this, calling for this. Now, I'm going to end up with these slides from the Universal House of Justice, where the Universal House of Justice, in the very next year, you know, the World Council of Churches statement and call for repudiation and dismantling of these things. The very next year, that was in 2012, and in 2013, the very next year, you have a letter from the Universal House of Justice to the Baha'is of Iran, where they talk about the principles of the oneness of humankind, and that implies an organic change in the very structure of society. What should be stated plainly here is that Baha'is do not believe the transformation thus envisioned will come about exclusively through their own efforts. And we've seen here these examples that I've given. This is not just Baha'is doing this. You have Christian groups. You have presidents of the United States. You have people from various walks of life, not necessarily Baha'i, who are doing this. And the Universal House of Justice goes on to say, nor are they trying to create a movement that would seek to impose on society their vision of the future. Every nation and every group, indeed every individual, will, to a greater or lesser degree, contribute to the emergence of the world civilization towards which humanity is irresistibly moving. Much as the Friends must guard against in any way ever seeming to identify themselves or the cause with any political party, they must also guard against the other extreme of never taking part with other progressive groups in conferences or committees designed to promote such activity and entire accord with our teachings, such as, for instance, better relations. So in addition to pointing out that that Baha'is and non-Baha'is are making these efforts, and that this is something that humanity is irresistibly moving towards the emergence of this world civilization. The Universal House of Justice in 2017 is quoting Shoghi Effendi about the Friends and better race relations, and it is saying that to the Baha'is specifically, this involvement in activities for social reform and well-being can, in certain circumstances, even extend to taking part in demonstrations. A letter written on the Guardian's behalf indicated that he did not see any objection to Baha'i students taking part as Baha'is in a protest concerning racial prejudice on campus, since there was nothing political about it, and he does not see how they could remain indifferent when fellow students were voicing our own Baha'i attitude on such a vital issue and one we feel so strongly about. So at the same time, the House of Justice is saying that individual Baha'is are free to participate in those efforts and activities, such as peaceful rallies that uphold constructive aims in consonance with the Baha'i hearings, for example, the promotion of social justice, the elimination of all forms of discrimination, and the safeguarding of human rights. But at the same time, they need to avoid, U.S. Baha'is need to avoid polarization and fragmentation, such as going on right now in the United States. So one of the current features of the process of disintegration of the old world order manifested in the United States is this increasing polarization and fragmentation. And we as Baha'is we do still need to be avoiding that. Yet justice is essential, and the Universal House of Justice highlights that, saying, as Baha'u'llah stated, say, no man can attain his true station except through his justice. No power can exist except through unity. No welfare and no well-being can be attained except through consultation. In this light, justice is indeed essential to resist the vain imaginings and idle fancies of social and political machinations, to see reality with one's own eyes, and to identify the requirements for an equitable social order. But then unity is essential, forged through the consultative processes, including action and reflection, to achieve the power required for positive social change. And then so they're also, the Universal House of Justice, going back to the 2013 letter, It says Baha'is across the globe in the most unassuming settings are striving to establish a pattern of activity and the corresponding administrative structures that are needed. And that justice as a faculty of the soul enables the individual to distinguish truth from falsehood, and it guides the investigation of reality, and it's essential. So Baha'is can learn and grow in capacity. So in their reflections on how to contribute to the betterment of the world, Baha'is will undoubtedly recognize that demonstrations are not the only or even the most effective means available to them. Rather, they can learn and grow in capacity over time to help their fellow citizens to frame concerns in a way that rises above fissures, to share views in a way that transcends divisive approaches, and to create and participate in spaces to work together in the quest to enact solutions to the problems that bedevil their nation. Okay, and so we just have a few more slides. The Universal House of Justice goes on to say that numerous, of course, are the questions that the process of learning now underway in all regions of the world must address, and including how to enable contingents of men and women to break free from the confines of passivity and the chains of oppression in order to engage in activities conducive to their spiritual, social, and intellectual development. And quoting from the Hidden Words of Baha'u'llah during his exile by Baghdad, "O son of spirit," and I read this before, but here I've underlined some of the verbs. Turn not away, neglect it not, neglect justice not, see with thine own eyes, thou shalt know of thine own knowledge, ponder this in thy heart, set it then before thine eyes. These are all actions. It's not passivity. It's actions that we take, that we do. And avoid the Universal House of Justice in the 2017 letter admonishes us to avoid what they call their dichotomies, sort of these non-existent dichotomies, where unfortunately sometimes when approaching such important and deeply felt matters, the friends can create dichotomies where none exist. Thus, for example, it is contended that one must choose between either non-involvement in politics or social action, either teaching the faith or involvement with the society, either the institute process and community building activities, and so on. Such apparent conflicts can be greatly dissipated by keeping in mind Shoghi Effendi's advice, conveyed in a letter written on his behalf, to conceive of the teachings as one great whole with many facets. And there are many facets. And they may appear, truth may, in covering different subjects, appear to be contradictory, the same letter indicated, and yet it is all one if you carry the thought through to the end. A careful reading of the Baha'i Writings and the guidance of the House of Justice can clarify how two matters that appear to be in tension with one another are coherent once the concepts and principles that connect them are understood. Particular circumstances in the locality, timeliness, and the periodic need for focus also have a bearing on such issues. So Baha'is are not seeking political power. They're not to accept political posts or become entangled in partisan issues. But at the same time, out of a sincere desire to serve their countries, they choose to pursue political aspirations or to engage in political activities. They do, respect those who choose to do that. The approach adopted by the Baha'i community of non-involvement in such activity is not intended as a statement expressing some fundamental objection to politics as in true sense. Indeed, humanity itself organizes itself through political affairs. Baha'is vote in civil elections as long as they do not have to identify themselves with any party in order to do so. In this connection, they review government as a system for maintaining the welfare and orderly progress of a society, and they conclude one and all to observe the laws of the land in which they reside without allowing their inner religious beliefs to be violated. Baha'is will not be party to any instigation to overthrow a government, nor will they interfere in political relations between the governments of different nations. And this doesn't mean that Baha'is are naive about political processes, but that wherever they reside, Baha'is endeavor to uphold the standard of justice in addressing inequities directed toward themselves or towards others, but only through lawful means available to them, eschewing all forms of violent protest. Moreover, in no way does the love they hold in their hearts for humanity run counter to the sense of duty they feel to expend their energies in service to their respective countries. And so that concludes my slideshow presentation, and I guess it's going to be open to questions at this point. And I'm sorry it was kind of long.
It's all right. Thank you very much, Valerie. It was a fascinating example of sort of, you might say, of spiritual, legal, and ethical principles from two different sides. The Baha'i writings, on the one hand, emphasizing equality, justice, inclusion, empowerment, and on the other hand, the various doctrines that enabled the Europeans to take over the continent and destroy, to the extent they could, the native inhabitants of the land, and to subdue them and to subjugate them and to attempt to change to eliminate their cultures, really. So I thank you very much for giving us this really overview of the legal underpinnings. It's very exciting to see that they are being questioned more and more, being undermined. In Canada as well, there have been, of course, court cases, as I understand it lately, that have questioned this doctrine of discovery as well. And there is a very interesting comment, if I can pop this up on my screen so I can read it enough. June Blue, Anishinaabe, says in a little comment that she's made, she's indigenous and a fifth-generation Baha'i. She wants to let everyone know that there are some ceremonial youth from St. Paul, Minnesota, going to see the Pope in May to ask him to abolish the doctrine of discovery. And then she adds, Chi miigwish, which Ogichi Idaa Ikwe. Thank you very much, warrior woman. I'm afraid I don't know the language, and therefore I can't pronounce it perfectly, but I hope I've conveyed the thought. And June Blue has been a marvelous contributor to our Wilmot Institute courses, and occasionally I think she's commented also on the web talk. So thank you, June, for offering us this particular comment. It says here she has already left, so I don't know. She'll have to hear it on the recording later, I guess. Shahla, not seeing June's comment, says, perhaps the current Pope will revoke the papal edict. It is difficult for them to do this because they have to make conflicting conclusions from the same document, the Gospel. This also has also happened relative to slavery, first supporting it, then having to reject it based on the same scriptures. So I don't know if you have any comment back to Shahla about that one.
Well, Pope Francis might. I mean, John Paul passed away, so, and so now we have Pope Francis. So who knows? Maybe so. I mean, we do have the World Council of Churches. I mean, there are people from all walks of life who are questioning these things.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a new day, and you can't hold to the same old interpretations of Scripture now that were obvious to people hundreds of years ago. The very statements that you quoted from the Pope about the assumed superiority of Christian rule over others, the natural right of Christians to conquer and convert others, it's not clear that these are based in the New Testament at all, or even the Old Testament. These were the assumptions of people 500 years ago, and they're no longer acceptable, I think, to the majority of Christians today. I suspect there's still some people who will hold to them, but I think the majority of Christians would repudiate those ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Pergea adds, great talk. Wish you had much more time. How may we access the slides? Thank you ever so much. And I'm assuming we'll be able to put the slides up on our website, so people will be able to get them there. We'll PDF them so that it'll be available as a PDF on our website with Valerie's permission, of course.
Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Let's see, there's something else, yeah. And Gil Murrow adds that the doctrine of discovery is more about race and color than about the principles of Christianity. And perhaps that's true nowadays. I wonder if that was true in the 1500s, when concepts of race and color weren't quite what they are now. I'm trying to remember, what year did you say that was, 1493? The Doctrine of Discovery?
1452 to 1493. There were a series of them, and it was in that period from like 1452 to around 1493 that those papal bulls came out.
Starting with the anti-Saracen ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which were the basis of the Reconquista of Spain and Portugal, of the Iberian Peninsula, I suppose.
Yeah, well, it was interesting that I mean, this was Catholicism. You know, you didn't really have the Protestant churches that you have today, but when Queen Elizabeth, you know, basically withdrew or repudiated the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope and everything at that time, they just incorporated the doctrine of discovery. They didn't make that kind of distinction between, well, this is a Catholic, this is from the Pope. We don't no longer recognize the authority of the Pope. They just explicitly incorporated that all into the Protestant Christianity as well.
They just grandfathered it in.
Huh? I'm sorry.
They grandfathered it in.
Yes, they grandfathered it in. Yes.
The Pope's interpretations were grandfathered into Protestantism. Yeah.
Yes, and then the grandfathered into the United States law, the federal Indian law. Yeah.
Yeah.
From Europe, and they exclusively did it in the Marshall Trilogy.
This has been really quite a marvelous presentation that way, because I think it will help people understand the situation. Are you aware of you mentioned Obama's speech? Are you aware of increasing legal pressure in the United States to change these things?
The doctrine of discovery, you mean specifically, or its aftermath?
Yeah.
Well, I'll just say with the doctrine of discovery, there is, I mean, you can, some of those links will take you to, there have been things that reported in Indian Country Today. There is, and in fact, you know, I'm teaching, like I said, I'm teaching a high school course on comprehensive law studies, and I've been using the We the People civics education, which is used across the country. And in fact, on that webpage, if you go to the We the People civics education webpage, they actually have the doctrine of discovery up there. Mm-hmm. And some of my slides are taken from that. They have a section that talks about the Marshall Trilogy. So you do have within the United States, within American education, the We the People is directed at elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools in the social studies and civics. And so they have incorporated that in there. I was actually rather surprised when I saw that because, of course, I didn't grow up with that in school. I
never learned about that. I was still raised on all those cowboy and Indian movies, those terrible cowboy and Indian movies. And you didn't see much better than that, much improvement in my childhood. In fact, when my kids were watching television back in, just maybe 2003, 2004, we were watching the old Walt Disney's Peter Pan. And if you remember the scene in there with the Indians in Peter Pan, it's absolutely terrible. It's incredibly stereotyped with people saying how and these kinds of things. It's I'm sure nobody thought of it as offensive when that Peter Pan movie was made by Walt Disney in whatever that was, 1940 something. But it's an embarrassment. You don't want your children to see it anymore. That particular scene. I also well, actually, there's another comment here. Sue Emmel as her comment's been forwarded here, I look forward to the day when our status reports lead to effective action plans in each of our local communities. Thank you for this stimulating presentation. I was wondering if there was also, what's the word I want to say, word I want to use here, a kind of counter trend in American history that's worth exploring, of some efforts by courts to protect Indian rights. I think specifically the Cherokee appealed their expulsion orders that Jackson gave them to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the Cherokees' right to stay on their lands, and Andrew Jackson's response was that he has an army and that the Supreme Court doesn't. And so he was going to expel the Cherokee anyway. But it seems to me that I had heard this. I don't know if this is correct information, but there has been in some cases, Supreme Court decisions and other court decisions that certainly supported Indian rights to land.
Well, since that time, yes, there have been. I mean, but with the Removal Act, I mean, Indians were removed.
Oh, yeah.
That was the 1830s. But since that time, there have been, and one, I couldn't put all of it in there. It was really kind of hard to pick, but that AIRFA, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978, is one of the more notable ones. I mean, it wasn't until 1978, and even after that, there have been some real problems with enforcing it. But you do have a lot of this stuff is ongoing, and there are groups like Native American Rights Fund. Federal Indian law is taught in a lot of the major law schools. It wasn't before. And as I said, this is filtering into at least the We the People civics education, and you do have this We Shall Remain, and you also have, even though this is focusing on slavery, this is something that just came out this year, and I just thought it was amazing that they pulled together all this information to try to get this going in all aspects of all facets of American life, so that we can be more educated, and we don't just see the Peter Pan representation of Native Americans.
Yeah, exactly. Several other responses now. Paul asks you about Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, and whether you found that useful. I know my daughter had it and studied it in high school a bit.
I'm not familiar with it. What did you say it was?
Howard Zinn, Z-I-N-N, A People's History of the United States, and it's very good. What I recall about it focuses very much on issues of oppression, genocide, confiscation of land, white privilege, these kinds of issues. It's used in high schools, I believe.
Actually, I've heard that title, but I've never seen it. I've never read it myself, and I haven't seen it used in high school. But apparently somewhere there has been. So.
Yeah, my daughter was using it a few years back when she was a freshman or a sophomore, I think. That was Paul. Shahla, who I've got other people too, but Shahla has another comment here. She'd already commented once. It's good to hear from her again. I was part of a reparation trial. There I heard that the churches, based on their conception of inferiority of the blacks on the Bible, some even referred to the stories of Cain and Abel. What else could the Pope claim inspired his conclusions? So she's asking about the biblical texts that have been used for oppression, I think.
Well, I think the Cain and Abel one is the big one, but the Pope just said was more like by the authority of God, and you can see the actual translation. It was written in, the papal bulls were written in Latin at that time, but you can get English translations. It's available online. One of my sites, you can look at it, and I had it as a database question in my high school class. So, but he says things like authority of God, and he doesn't get into things like Cain and Abel, though I have, heard that said as well. I do know that in the teaching hard history, I did see there's some references in there to, you know, how the masters of the slaves would, you know, because they were the ones teaching Christianity to the African American slaves at that time. They would do things like say, you know, think of me as God. You know, they had their own interpretation. It was a corruption of slavery. I mean, not slavery, corruption of Christianity.
Sure.
And some of it is, you know, it's in writing, and there a lot of it actually that documented how they were, you know, corrupting their own religion and saying things like, you know, you think of me, the master, as God.
Yep.
And of course, the black slaves came up with their own version of Christianity, didn't see it that way, you know, and see this as something that was legitimized by the Bible. But their masters had quite a different view. And if you look at, I don't know if people have seen 12 Years a Slave, I mean, that, you know, they refer to the Bible, the masters referring to the Bible in there too.
Yep.
You know, that's a God-given right to do what he did.
And they didn't teach the part about Moses leading people out of slavery into the promised land either, that's for sure. They stuck to the references to the Canaanites being the hewers of wood and the drawers of water, because they were the people that right there and on the coastal plain next to Judea that the Israelites conquered. And of course the Canaanites supposedly were Hamites, in other words Africans, and therefore that idea got extended to all Africans. Whitney has a question. I want to make sure I didn't miss one here in between. Yeah, no, that's the next comment here. Whitney says, I'm going to start at the top here. Thank you so much for such an eye-opening and rich talk. Especially enlightening for me was your connection, you're connecting the invaders/conquerors to Abdu'l-Baha's discussion of the treatment of criminals and his emphasis on justice versus forgiveness and mercy. Do you have any thoughts on reconciliation efforts moving forward in countries post-genocide, i.e. Rwanda, and whether there is any role for this kind of work for Americans seeking to grapple with our own genocidal history?
Well, I believe that in Canada they have official reconciliation
They do.
organizations of some kind, and I know that in like Guatemala and some of those other the Spanish-speaking countries, they have some version, you know, formalized reconciliation efforts. In the United States, I'm not aware of any formalized ones, but as far as forgiveness, actual forgiveness, I mean, indigenous peoples have been saying for a long time that, you know, you're forgiven. It's not really about getting the forgiveness of indigenous peoples. It's like, well, what next? Mm-hmm. You've been forgiven, now what?
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of what's going on in the U.S. as far as formal reconciliation efforts.
Bill, actually, there's, well, it's one long posting that I guess it got divided. Thank you for this fine example of applying academic analysis to a pivotal social issue. It both inspires and helps me reflect on the difference between individual and organizational roles and what Baha'u'llah brought to humanity by applying revelation to organizational behavior.
That's very interesting. It is. The Universal House of Justice is, those letters are really, I wish I didn't have to rush through them, you know, because I was going on a long time. But they're really wonderful to study and to really reflect on. They're very, very good.
And that 2013 letter to the Iranian Baha'i community is extremely important for talking about the application of Baha'i principles to social issues. That's the letter that you quoted one or two times, I think. And that particular letter is really very important. Gary,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just agreeing with you.
Gary says there still seem to be many paternalistic attitudes embedded in the BIA the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and laws governing its handling of Native American issues. Are there active attempts to change these?
Oh, yes. Well, there's a lot going on in Indian country and with the BIA, and a good place to look. I mean, there are a number of resources that you can look and keep track of to see what's actually going on today. There's the website of the National Congress of American Indians, of the website of the United South and Indian Tribes. There's groups like Native American Rights Funds. They all have a lot of news on them and information that talks about some of the things that are going on contemporaneously right now, as far as the BIA is concerned and Indian affairs are concerned in the United States. Just a number of resources.
That's good to know. Well, that's the end of the questions that we have. So we're very grateful for that, Valerie. And thank you for a third time.
Thank you.